breeze came up from the courtyard wrong. That is the only way I can describe it. Air moving against her curtains in a direction the wind was not coming from. I was across the courtyard before I had finished thinking, and the shadow inside her chamber had a silver blade, blackened along the edge, and I took his throat in my hand and I took my time with it, because there was a part of me that wanted him to know what had come for him in the last second of his life. Behind me, on the bed, she sat up without sound. She did not draw the dagger under her pillow. She watched me lower the body to the carpet the way a man lowers a sleeping child. She watched my eyes when they were not human, and she did not look away.
I should be afraid of you.
You should.
I am more afraid that I am not.
Then, very quietly,
Sit down.
a king sat at a mortal woman's command in her own bedchamber, with a body cooling on the carpet between us. I had been guarding her bloodline for 7 generations. I had not, until that moment, understood what I was actually being asked to do. Chapter 1. The Empty Frame. The wax was crumbling. I noticed it the way a man notices his own pulse, late, and only because something else had drawn his attention to it. My thumb had been pressing the seal for the better part of an hour while I stood in front of the empty frame, and when I lifted my hand to my chest, there was a fine dust of red along the pad of my finger. The seal had survived ambushes, fires, 3 royal funerals, and a flood in the south wing. It was choosing tonight to fail. The portrait gallery at midnight smelled of old varnish and candle smoke. The candles in their iron stands had burned low enough to gutter, and the dust hung in the air like the place was breathing very slowly around me. I knew every painting in this hall by the shape of its frame in the dark. The Merrywick women, generation by generation. The one who had laughed too loud at her wedding, the one who had outlived 2 husbands and died of nothing, the one I had watched bleed quietly in a corridor while a midwife shouted for water. Their daughters, their daughters' daughters. 7 portraits, 7 graves I had stood over and not approached. And 1 empty frame. I had commissioned it 80 years ago when I still believed I knew the shape of grief well enough to prepare a space for it. Behind me, a floorboard breathed. She was barefoot. For 6 nights I had listened for her and pretended otherwise, a particular kind of dishonesty I had grown skilled at across 3 centuries. I kept my face toward the empty frame. There was no need to turn. I knew the cadence of her step now the way I knew the wax under my thumb, by repetition, by waiting.
Why does a king without a god pray to paintings?
Her voice was lower than I expected at this hour. Smoke roughened by sleep, but precise. The voice of a woman who chose her sentence before she spoke it. I lied without thinking.
I review the lineage of my bride-to-be. The alliance demands familiarity.
At midnight, in the dark.
I prefer the company.
I felt her come closer. She did not announce it. Her sleeping robe whispered against the floor and stopped at a polite distance. From the edge of my vision, I could see her. Chestnut hair down her back, a ribbon tied around her wrist where it should not have been. Silver, almost white eyes that read brighter than my own in the candlelight. The freckles I had spent 2 weeks pretending not to notice.
Your hand.
She said. I did not move it.
It hasn't left the letter since I came in.
I considered telling her that habit was the last thing immortality gave a man, that bodies kept their rituals when minds had forgotten why. Instead, I said,
Was there something you required, Princess?
My grandmother kept a journal.
The candle nearest me popped, spilling a fleck of wax onto the floor. My gaze stayed on the empty frame.
She wrote about a silver-eyed shadow at every deathbed in our family for 7 generations, including her own.
A small pause, not for breath, for aim.
Did the shadow ever weep?
The question struck the way a bell struck when you stood inside the tower. Not as sound, but as displacement of air. I felt the gallery change around me. The portraits were not the audience I had thought they were. Something had been watching back the whole time, and it had a name now, and the name belonged to the woman 3 steps behind me. Silence was the only answer I had.
I will walk you to your chambers.
I said. She let me. We did not speak. The corridors at that hour were lit by recessed lamps that burned low and steady, and her bare feet made almost no sound on the cold stone, and I matched her pace as I had been trained to do, which is to say 1/2 step behind, a guardian's distance, the distance I had kept from her ancestors at every deathbed she had just named. At her door she turned and looked at me with the kind of patience that was not patient at all. I bowed. She inclined her head. She stepped inside and the door closed. And then I heard a sound I had never heard at this threshold before. A bolt slid home from the inside. I had not known there was a bolt on that door. I stood in the corridor for a long moment with my hand still over my chest, the letters still folded against my ribs, the wax dust still on my thumb. 6 nights she had tracked me. She had named the shadow on the first conversation. She had locked her door not against assassins, but against me. She had not come here as a bride. I walked back to the gallery the long way, past windows where the moonlight came through in long, careful slabs, and I tried to remember the exact phrasing of Gideon's oath as he had spoken it, blood on his teeth and his hand against my throat. Watch over them. Keep them safe. That had been the shape of it. The voice had been thin by then, and I had not asked him to clarify because he had been dying and because I had thought I understood. I touched the letter through the velvet of my coat. I had been so sure I understood. Chapter 2. The Alliance Feast. The great hall was set in crimson and black the next evening, and they had hung the chandeliers low enough that the crystals cast fractured light across the faces of my nobles. I watched them arrive in pairs, old houses, old grudges, old polished smiles, and I tried not to count exits or measure throats, which is a thing I do in rooms where I'm uneasy. I seated her 1 chair closer to my throne than protocol allowed. Every noble in the hall noticed. Severin Morncliffe noticed first. He tilted his head back a degree, the way he always did before he wielded the small jeweled hilt of his dagger as punctuation, and he smiled without showing his teeth, which was worse. Julienne sat beside me in a gown the color of old blood, her own kingdom's deep burgundy, worn at my court like a banner planted in soft earth. 2 generations ago, her grandmother's brother had killed 3 of my cousins on a frozen bridge, and most of the men at this table remembered being told the story by their fathers. Her hair was pinned up. The ribbon was no longer at her wrist. She had braided it into the knot at her nape. I knew she had a slim blade somewhere on her, and not knowing where was the kind of distraction I had not allowed myself to feel about another person in 200 years. The watered wine came first. The steward who filled her glass from a flask the other nobles did not use was one of Severin's, a man I had failed to remove from the household when I had reorganized the kitchen staff last winter, and now I would have to live with what that small mercy had purchased. The wine in her cup was paler than my own. Her fingers never tightened on the stem. She lifted the glass and set it down again without drinking. The tarnished goblet came second. The ceremonial bridal cup presented to her with what would have looked, to the uninitiated, like reverence. The cup was an heirloom. Morncliffe's house had arranged for it to be presented unpolished, the silver dimmed to a color closer to lead, a small ugliness, a signal that her presence was tolerated, not honored. She thanked the servant and did not bring the cup to her lips. I felt the muscle in my jaw set, and I made myself unset it. Then Leontes Arkwright stood up. The foreign ambassador had a habit of tapping the amber knob of his cane against the floor before he spoke at length, and he did it now, twice. As if calling a meeting to order in his own house, he raised his glass.
To the bride,
He said warmly.
and to the durability of her line.
The smile he wore was the smile of a man bringing a gift.
It is, of course, a tender matter. The women in the Merriwick bloodline have such an unfortunate history of early deaths. We must hope our princess proves the exception.
A silence opened in the hall like a wound.
Has she chosen her tomb yet?
My glass splintered in my hand. It was a thin pop, almost discreet, but every vampire in the room heard it, and every mortal saw the wine bloom across the white cloth like a struck artery. I did not look at the stain. I looked at Leontes, and I held his eyes, and I waited for him to remember what court he was standing in. Julienne spoke without looking at him.
Ambassador,
She said in a voice that was not loud.
your nation imports 3/4 of its iron through ports that lie within my father's lawful customs. The treaty that protects that flow was signed by my grandmother. The renewal is signed by me. You will find, if you check the seal, that I am the exception your bloodline now depends on.
The hall went very quiet. She turned her glass, the watered one, by the stem, a small, deliberate motion.
Pour me your own wine.
She said to me.
If you would not mind, the vintage at this end of the table seems to have traveled badly.
I took my own cup and poured into hers. The servants saw, the nobles saw, Severin saw, and his smile did not move, which is how I knew the gesture had landed exactly where I'd aimed it. Every household in this kingdom would hear by morning that I had poured from my cup to a mortal woman's at a public table. I had just painted a target on both of us. She lifted the cup, met my eyes for one beat longer than protocol allowed, and drank. Later, on the terrace, she cornered me beside a low stone balustrade where snow was beginning to gather in the carved hollows. Her breath came out in soft white plumes. Mine did not. She watched that absence with a faint, considering frown, the way a craftsman might study an unfamiliar joint.
You made it worse.
It was already that.
He was reaching. I had already broken his hand. You made the rest of the room look at me as a thing being protected.
She poured her own wine then, from the bottle the terrace servant had left at her elbow, keeping the glass well outside my reach.
I have survived hostile courts since I was 9. Your protection made me look weaker, not safer.
I should have apologized. The apology was on my tongue. I felt it there, with the taste of the spilled wine.
You drank from my cup.
I said instead. She looked at me for a long, dry moment.
You poured your own. I drank. That was the second move. Don't confuse it with the first.
She left me there. Her breath made small ghosts ahead of her down the terrace, and mine made none. And the cold sat between us where a third person would have stood if a third person had been allowed. I touched my collar without realizing. The scar beneath it was a thin, old line, and it had not hurt in 3 centuries, and tonight, for no reason I could name, it ached. Chapter 3. The Letter and the Crumbling Seal. I read the letter in my study when my hands needed something to do. I did not read all of it. I never had. I read the first lines. Brother, if this is in your hands, I have already gone where you cannot follow. Do not let them bury me where the soldiers will look for a hero. And then I read the middle paragraphs about his sister, about his debts, about a bay mare he wanted given to a boy in a village whose name no longer existed. I read the part where he had asked me to look after the line, which was the part I had memorized and turned into law. And then I stopped. I always stopped at the same place. The seal at the bottom, the longer passage Gideon had folded shut against my prying with a soldier's neat hand and an officer's wax stamp, had not been opened. Across 3 centuries, the excuse had changed shape. First, I was waiting for the right night. Later, once that lie wore thin, I claimed I had already done what the passage would have asked, and the reading was only a formality I could afford to postpone. The truth was simpler and uglier. I was afraid of what it said. I sat in the firelight with the letter open before me, the wax crumbling now in a small drift along the desk's edge, and I considered for the 1,000th time the shape of the unopened paragraph beneath my hand. Then Jacob entered, without knocking, which is what Jacob always did, and which is why he was the only person in the world who could find me at this hour.
Sire,
Jacob.
He laid 2 things on the desk. One was a folded slip with broken seals, already opened, already read. The other was a slimmer card.
The household talks. They are paid to. Not about her, about you.
He looked at me without softening it.
they are saying the king's blood has remembered how to want.
I let that sit.
The second item.
Coded message intercepted at the south gate.
I unfolded it. The cipher was one I had built 200 years ago for a war that no longer mattered, and the Merrywick court still used it because court ciphers outlive the men who write them. The message was short. It requested, in carefully bureaucratic phrasing, the formal repatriation of Princess Julian Fern Merrywick's remains, should she die on foreign soil with appropriate ceremony and within 30 days. Someone at her own court was preparing for a body.
Sire, I see it. She should be told. She should be.
I agreed. I held the message over the candle. The paper caught. I watched it darken and curl, and Jacob watched me watch it. And when the corner had eaten halfway to my fingers, I dropped it in the brass dish and let the rest go.
That did not happen.
I said. Jacob's mouth did not move. His eyes moved once, the way a man's eyes move when he has just watched his king begin a pattern he has seen before and has been hoping not to see again.
As you say, sire.
He left. I folded Gideon's letter and tucked it back against my chest, and a fleck of brittle wax fell from the seal onto the desk and stayed there. The lie I needed came readily. If she knew, she would demand a leave, and leaving was the same as dying, because the road home was longer than the road to the chapel they would use. Protection, I decided, was the word for what I was doing. The wax on the desk did not move when I rose to go. It crumbled a little more under the weight of nothing at all. Chapter 4. The Winter Garden. She found me in the conservatory on the 4th night after the feast. I did not hide from her, exactly. I went to the cold places because the cold was easier than the warm ones, and the Winter Garden was the coldest place in the castle that was not underground. The glass walls held frost in patterns that climbed each pane in repeating ferns. Moonlight came through silvered and faint. The roses, which were the Dowager Queen's project from a generation I'd buried, had died years before. Someone, Jacob probably, kept them iced into stillness, so that the conservatory always smelled faintly of nothing, the way frost smells of nothing. She was wrapped in a fur-lined cloak. Her breath gathered at her lips and lifted in slow, visible clouds. Mine did not. I had been standing very still beside a dead rose for some time, and the contrast in the glass, her warm life, my absence, was visible enough that I looked away first.
You have read her journals,
She said without preamble.
haven't you?
I have read enough of them to know they exist.
How long have you been watching my family die?
She did not ask it like a child asks a question. She asked it like a magistrate.
Long enough.
How long?
I considered her. I could have given her an evasion polished enough to satisfy a court, But the conservatory was not a court, and she was not the kind of woman who could be paid in polish.
7 generations.
No gasp escaped her. The answer landed in her like a blow she had been bracing for.
You swore an oath to someone.
Yes.
To whom?
His name stayed behind my teeth. It lived in my mouth like a stone I had been turning under my tongue for 3 centuries, and I could not give it to her in a glass house full of dead roses. She heard the omission. Her jaw tightened. She reached out and touched one of the iced petals beside her, and the petal cracked off cleanly in her fingers like a piece of porcelain, and she looked at it in her palm as if it had personally betrayed her.
My mother.
Princess.
My mother bled out in childbirth. The midwife told my grandmother that a man in a long coat stood in the corridor and did not enter. My grandmother wrote it down. The midwife described his eyes.
I could hear the soft tick of cooling glass.
Why did you watch her die?
Julian said,
And do nothing.
The oath forbade direct interference. I could shape events from a distance. I could not be seen to...
Stop.
I stopped. She walked one slow step closer. Her breath made a small white shape between us.
That is not protection. That is company.
I had nothing. I had built a sentence in my mind for that question across 3 centuries, and the sentence did not survive being said in front of her face.
You stood in a corridor while my mother died.
She said,
And you wrote it down in your head, and you have been carrying it with you ever since. And you have called it grief. It is not grief. Grief is what the living do. You have been keeping vigil at a window.
Her voice never rose. That was the worst of it. Dismissal would have been cleaner. Instead, she walked out, an inversion of court protocol. A princess does not leave the king in a room without first being released from his presence, and I let her. Because to demand otherwise would have been to claim a thing I no longer believed I had. The petal she had broken off lay on the floor where she had dropped it. My hand had found my collar without my permission, and my fingers were pressed against the line of the scar through 3 layers of cloth. I stood there until the candles in the corridor beyond began to gutter for want of tending, and then I walked back through my own castle as if I were a guest in it. Chapter 5. Sit down. I watched her chambers from the balcony across the courtyard. I had done this every night since she had arrived. She knew nothing of it. I would not have known how to tell her. The balcony belonged to an unused suite on the opposite wing, and from it I could see the seam of light beneath her door, the angle of her bed through the gauze of the inner curtain, and the dark shape of her sleeping with her back to the wall. She slept with a dagger under her pillow. I had counted 17 nights of this. 17 nights of watching a woman who had locked her door against me sleep with her hand near a blade. The balcony had no proper name. Tonight, I had begun to think of it as my confession. The breeze came up from the courtyard wrong. That is the only way I can describe it. The air moved against the silk of her curtains in a direction the wind was not coming from. I felt it across the courtyard the way one feels a wrong note in music, not as sound, but as a small failure of the world to behave. I was already across the courtyard before I had finished thinking. The shadow detached itself from the inside wall of her chamber as I came through the balcony doors. It had a silver blade. The blade had been blackened along the edge, which is what poisoners do when they want a wound to do more than open. My hand closed on the assassin's throat before he had finished turning, and I lifted him off his feet because I needed the body intact and because there was a part of me that wanted him to know what had come for him in the last second of his life. His eyes did not have time to widen. I broke his hand first so the silver fell. I broke the other so his fingers would not reach the second blade I had felt under his coat. Then I took his throat between my fingers and I tightened them by careful degrees. watching his pulse work against my thumb, listening to the dry click in his neck when one small thing inside it gave and another did not. I held him there, past the point of dying and into the place where dying takes its time. I wanted him to feel each second of what he had been paid to bring her. I'm not proud of this. I'm being honest about the shape of what I am. Behind me, on the bed, Julienne sat up without sound. I had time, in the last instant, to see her hand under the pillow. Her hand remained under the pillow. She watched me. She watched the assassin's body go slack in my hand, watched me lower it to the carpet with the same care a man would use lowering a sleeping child, and her gaze held through all of it. I let him down. I stepped back. My eyes had gone inhuman. I felt the change burning through them. I kept my face turned aside until several still seconds had passed and the hunger eased.
How did you reach me so fast?
She said. I had practiced lies for this question. I had built them for years.
I watch your chambers from the balcony across the courtyard.
I have done so every night since you arrived.
The pause that followed was the longest pause of my long life.
I should be afraid of you.
You should.
I am more afraid that I am not.
The words were not a confession. They had the cool precision of a woman naming a symptom of an illness she had decided to study. I felt her words against the scar under my collar, which was absurd because the scar had been dead matter for 300 years.
Princess.
My voice was not steady.
I do not know where the protection ends and the violation begins. I have not known for some time. I should not have.
Sit down.
2 words. Quiet. I sat. There was a small chair beside her writing desk. I sat in it. A king sat at a mortal woman's command in her own bedchamber, with a body cooling on the carpet between us and her hand still resting where the dagger was hidden. No absolution came. Her hand stayed by the pillow. She watched me sit, watched me look away from the body, and then she said,
Stay there.
I stayed. She got out of bed. She wrapped a robe around her shoulders. She knelt beside the assassin and turned his head with a hand that did not shake, and she looked at his collar, and her nose wrinkled very faintly at something I could already smell.
That is my perfume.
She said. I had already noticed. I had been hoping she would not. She rose. She came back across the room. She sat on the edge of the bed opposite my chair, and she looked at me in the dim with her silver, almost white eyes, and she said very softly,
Someone in this castle is helping them.
Yes.
You knew this was possible.
I did not know it had happened until tonight.
She nodded once, accepting it. No question followed. I think the answer was still a thing she was not ready to hold. She tucked her hands under her arms, and she let the silence sit between us with the body. And we did not speak again until Jacob arrived to take the corpse away, which he did without expression, as he had done many other ugly small tasks over a very long time. When Jacob had gone, she said,
You will not watch me from the balcony tonight.
You will watch me from that chair.
I did not move. She lay back down. She turned deliberately so that her back was no longer to the wall but to me, the most exposed sleeping posture she had used since she had arrived in my kingdom. I understood that it was a test. I understood also that it was a gift. I sat in the chair until dawn. She slept. The hand near the dagger never left it. Chapter 6. The Tattoo and the Lie. The underground examining room smelled of cold stone and clean iron. Jacob had laid the body out on the long table, and torchlight made long animal shadows on the wall behind him. I worked the dead man's clothing with patience. The poison on the silver was a Morncliffe recipe. I had seen a variation of it in an attempt on my uncle 600 years ago, and the blade carried a small mark at the hilt I had been hoping not to find. Behind the right ear, an inch above the hairline where a barber would not look, there was a small black mark. A house sigil. Severin's house.
Morncliffe.
Jacob said behind me.
Morncliffe. You will arrest him?
No,
Jacob waited.
I will have his house watched. Every gate, every messenger. I want the next move. The arrest only buys me the head. The watching buys me the body. And the leak inside her retinue.
I knew he would say it. My eyes stayed on the body.
The lady in waiting receives letters at odd hours. I have seen her go to the south wicket gate twice this week. She does not know I see her. Sabina.
I saw her again as I said the name. The small, fair-haired woman who had served the princess's wine on the night of the feast and whose hands had trembled when she set the carafe down. I had read the tremor as nerves in a hostile court. I had read wrong. The girl who had wept once, quietly, at the chapel door of her own quarters when she thought no one was passing.
She is gentle, sire. She is also lying. Have you any reason beyond letters?
She carries the princess's perfume on her sleeve. I noticed it the night of the feast.
The scent had passed me by. Julienne's hands, Severin's smile, the splintered glass. Those had held my attention, and the perfume had slipped through. I straightened. I covered the body. I gave Jacob orders about the watch and about the south gate, and I walked back up into the castle, where the morning had begun without me. I passed Julienne in the corridor outside the breakfast hall. She had not slept well. I could see it in the soft place beneath her eyes, and in the way she had braided her hair more carefully than usual, as if straightness were a defense. The ribbon was at her wrist again. She had pinned a small silver leaf into her hair near the temple, which was her quiet sign that she did not feel safe. She stopped in front of me.
Is there anything I should know?
She said. I considered her. I considered the bed she had let me watch her sleep in. I considered the ribbon at her wrist. I considered the slim handkerchief I had passed in Sabina's sleeve as I walked here, and the way Sabina's eyes had not lifted from the floor.
No.
I said. She watched my face for one moment longer than was comfortable.
Very well,
She said, and she passed me, and I did not look back, and the lie hung in the air behind me like a perfume I did not own. Chapter 7. The Name in the Margins. She found me in the armory. Being found was not the reason I had gone there. The sword on the third wall mount had not been touched in 100 years, and I needed to take it off the hook and feel the weight of it, though I had no good reason for needing such a thing. The sword was a plain campaign blade with a worn grip, and it had belonged to a man who had fought at the height of a war I had since erased from most histories. She came in carrying a book. Her approach reached me too late. That was happening more often. My hearing had begun to make exceptions for her. The book was open in her hands. A war chronicle, the kind that lived in the deeper archive with the records I had not destroyed, because destroying them would have been a tell.
this cage.
She said. I did not turn.
This page has marginalia in a hand I recognize from your study. The note in the margin describes a human general who took a sword meant for a vampire king at the Second Battle of Adel Marsh. The chronicle does not name him in the main text. It names him in the margin. The hand in the margin is yours.
I closed my hand on the hilt of the sword. The leather was old enough that it shifted slightly under my grip.
His name was Gideon.
I said. I had not said it aloud in 300 years. The word came out smaller than I had expected. It sounded almost like an ordinary man's name.
Gideon Merrywick.
Naomi was the middle name.
He was your friend.
Yes.
The word friend caught on the way out, the way a thread catches on a rough nail. I felt her watching it catch.
What was he like?
No one had ever asked me that. Across centuries, they had asked about his rank, his death, his campaigns, never what he was like.
He laughed at my fangs the first time he saw them. He said they made me look very serious about a thing that did not deserve to be taken that seriously. He had a tan that did not fade in winter, which I used to envy without knowing the word for what I was feeling. He could not sing. He sang anyway. He called me brother before I had earned it. After he saved my life, he asked me, very quietly, while he was dying, to look after his line.
She did not move.
He was a better man than the oath made me. I have not been honest about that, even with myself.
She came across the armory then, slowly, and stopped to step away from me and put her hand on mine on the hilt of the sword. Her hand was warm. I had not felt a warm hand on mine in a very long time, and it took a moment to register as touch and not as temperature.
You loved him.
I failed him.
That is not the same thing.
I did not pull my hand away. She did not either. The sword between us belonged to a man who had laughed at my fangs, and I had the unwelcome thought that he would have liked her, and that the thought was not a betrayal, and that I had spent a very long time afraid it would be. We stood there for a long time. Eventually, she lifted her hand and stepped back, and the armory came back into focus around us. The racks, the torches, the cold air, the door. And she said,
Tell me how he died.
Not here.
Tonight, then.
Tonight.
She nodded once. She left the chronicle open on the bench. The marginalia faced upward. The small, spidery line of my own handwriting visible in the margin like a confession I had filed against myself 100 years before she had been born. Chapter 8. The Library at Midnight. The library at midnight was warmer than the rest of the castle. The fire was burned down to embers when she came in. I had pulled 2 chairs close to the hearth, closer than I should have, and I had poured her a glass of wine she did not drink. I held nothing. She sat. She tucked her feet under her. The ribbon was at her wrist. I told her. The ambush in the pass at Adele Marsh, 307 years ago in the late autumn, when the road had been frozen at the top and slush at the bottom. I had not seen the second archer because I had been engaged with the first. Gideon turned, very fast, into the shape my own death had been taking. The blade went where my heart would have been if he had not stepped, and where his heart was instead. His last words, watch over them, keep them safe. His voice was thin by then. The letter was in his coat, and he pressed it into my hand with the seal already weakened by his blood. The field surgeon arrived too late. My own hands were on his chest. The snow at the top of the pass had begun, very gently, to come down on both of us as he died. I told her about commissioning the empty frame 80 years ago and how I had known even then that I was preparing space for a grief I would not allow myself to refuse. I told her about the 7 Merrywick women I had watched in order and the corridor outside her mother's chamber where I had stood and not entered, and what that had cost me to set down and what it had cost her family that I had not. She listened without moving. The wine in her glass did not lower. Her eyes did not leave my face. When I'd finished, she was quiet for a long time. The fire shifted in the grate, and a small log settled into the ash with a sound like a sigh.
Isaiah.
It was the first time she had used my name. I felt it in the scar.
You have spent 300 years
She said,
Seeking forgiveness from a dead man who already chose to die for you.
I did not answer. She pointed at my chest, where the letter was.
What does the sealed passage say?
I have not read it.
No surprise crossed her face. Suspicion had been waiting there. So had knowledge.
Open it, or stop pretending he is still talking to you.
She set the wine down. She rose. On her way past my chair, her hand brushed the back of it, and the almost touch was worse than contact would have been. She left me alone with the letter in the fire. I took it out. I held it in my hands. My thumb found the seal, and the wax shifted under it like sand. I felt the brittle edge of the lower fold against my fingertip. I almost broke it. I stopped. I put the letter back inside my coat. I sat in the chair. The embers went down to a thin red line and then to nothing, and my hand stayed on my chest over the unbroken wax, and the room around me cooled by slow degrees until the dark in the grate was the same dark as the dark beyond the window. Chapter 9. The seal breaks wrong. It took me 3 more nights to break it. When I did, it was in my chambers, alone. The candle burned to a stub. The letter unfolded on the desk in front of me. I touched the lower seal. The wax came apart at my thumb like something that had been waiting to fail. The old crest fell into 2 pieces, and a small dust of red in the inner fold sprang open of its own pressure, and I read, "Brother, I know what you will do. You will make my death into a chain and wear it forever. Do not." My hand stopped on the page. 3 sentences in, and he had seen me. He had seen me 300 years before I had finished, failing to see myself. I felt the room around me tilt very slightly, the way a deck tilts on a ship that has begun to take water. I read it again. Behind that, more lines. My eyes had begun to track them. Live. Live, you stubborn. The door slammed open. Jacob.
Sire, the council. Severin has called an emergency session. He is claiming...
Jacob stopped. He saw the letter open on my desk. He saw my face. He swallowed whatever he had been about to say, and then he said the rest of it.
He is claiming that your judgment has been compromised by the human bride. He has witnesses.
I did not move.
Sire.
I folded the letter slowly with hands that were not entirely steady, and I tucked it inside my coat against my chest, where it had always lived.
Hold the council. Tell them I am coming.
He went. I stood. I crossed to the basin and put my hands in the cold water and held them there until they remembered they were mine. And then I went down to the council chamber to defend a self I no longer believed I had. The chamber was already full when I came through the side door, which was the first insult. Severin had called the session, which meant Severin had set the room. He had taken the seat at the long table that ought to have been a step lower than mine, and he had taken it before I arrived, which made it look, to a noble counting status, as if I had walked into his meeting. He smiled at me. He did not stand.
Your Majesty, we were beginning to wonder.
You were beginning to enjoy yourself, Severin. Begin again, with my permission this time.
The smile widened by a degree. He tapped the jeweled hilt of his dagger against the lip of the table, once, lightly, the small punctuation he used when he wanted a room to feel the rhythm of his sentences.
3 witnesses. A steward, a chambermaid, a captain of the 3rd watch. They have observed your Majesty entering the princess's chambers at irregular hours, sitting through the night in a chair beside her bed, pouring from your own cup, walking unaccompanied to a balcony from which her windows can be observed. The household, my king, has reached a conclusion. I do not wish to be the man who names it, but it would be a dereliction of my seat at this table not to ask whether the alliance is being negotiated from a position of clarity.
You wish to ask whether I have lost my senses.
I wish to ask whether the bride has been a strategic decision or a private one.
I let the silence work for a count of 3. Old men, even old vampire men, will fill a silence with their own anxieties if you give it long enough.
I sat at her bedside.
I said,
On the night an assassin with a silver blade and a Morncliffe recipe on it came through her balcony doors. I have his body, I have his blade, I have the mark behind his ear. I have, gentlemen, been told that my judgment is compromised by a man who did not know, or perhaps knew very well, that an attempt on my bride's life would be intercepted before it could become his alibi.
Severin's hand did not move on the dagger hilt. His smile did not move either. Both of those things were tells.
An accusation, Your Majesty.
In accounting, the accusation comes when the watch is done.
I let them turn that over. Two of the older lords leaned back, which was what I had bought. One of the younger ones leaned forward, which was what I had cost. I had not won the room. I had postponed it. I had bought, at a guess, 3 days.
The session is adjourned. Lord Morncliffe, you will keep to your estates within the city walls until the watch concludes. The council will reconvene on the night of the masquerade, at which the alliance will be formally celebrated, and at which any remaining concerns may be raised in the presence of the princess herself.
Severin inclined his head a precise degree. The dagger tapped the table once more. I had seen him do that across 2 centuries of council sessions, and it had always meant the same thing. I will remember this. I will choose the place. I walked out before he could choose his exit. That, at least, I kept. In the corridor, I leaned for a moment against the cold stone with my hand over the letter, and I felt the wax through the cloth, and I thought, for the first time since I'd broken the seal, that I'd read the prediction and not the permission. I knew now that my friend had seen me. I did not yet know what he had wanted me to do. 3 centuries of structure, and it had cracked on 3 sentences. Chapter 10. The Mask. The masquerade was 3 nights later. I had agreed to it because the council demanded a public display of the alliance's stability, and because Severin had agreed to it, which meant he wanted it, which meant I could not allow him to be the only one in the room shaping its meaning. I had bought the 3 days at the council. I had not bought safety. Severin had used the days to send messages I had not yet been able to intercept. I dressed in faded wine and darkened silver. My cloak had its muted silver lining. My mask was plain, a half mask in smoke blue, no ornament, the only concession to disguise a man like me could afford to make. Julienne came down the great stair in silver and white. She wore neither kingdom's colors. The gown was pale and clean and structured, and she had pinned her hair up with a hairpin shaped like a small, narrow blade, and she carried no mask. Severin's house had sent her one earlier that evening, a delicate confection of pearl and crimson lace that would have made her look like a doll set on a shelf. She had sent it back. There had been no scene. The mask had simply never touched her face. The court noticed. The court always noticed. The great hall opened off the gallery corridor, and as I crossed to meet her, I saw through the open archway behind her shoulder the long line of portraits in the half-dark, and at the eastern wall, just visible at the angle of the doorway, the empty frame. It was very pale in the gallery lamps. From that distance, it seemed almost to be a window someone had forgotten to close. I lifted my mask from my face and walked across the floor to her. Without a word, I held the mask out and waited. She looked at it. She looked at me. She took it. The mask stayed in her hand, held by the ribbon. She let me see it there, and the room saw her see me, and the music adjusted around us the way music does when a string section discovers a new note in the conductor's hand. We danced. Court dances are not made for honesty. They are made for surveillance. The patterns let observers track who touches whom and how long and which directions the eyes are turning. We did all the protocol movements. We held our hands at the prescribed angles. We turned at the prescribed counts, and underneath all of it, our bodies moved closer by half inches as if the room were tilting slightly toward each other, and her breath came short, and my breath did not come at all. At the third turn, she said very quietly near my ear,
You have been lying to me about something for a week.
I did not answer.
I do not know yet what it is. I will. I am telling you so you understand that I will.
Princess.
Keep dancing.
We kept dancing. Severin raised his glass at the end of the third pattern. I had been expecting it.
To the alliance,
He said, loudly enough to carry.
which has clearly grown beyond paper. The king's blood seems to have remembered how to want.
Several nobles laughed politely, as if at a clever joke. My hand went to my sword on instinct, and Julian's hand caught mine before it reached the hilt. She did not look down. She kept her eyes on Severin. The whole court watched her stop me. I let her. I had just confirmed every suspicion he had needed. I did not regret it. We finished the dance. We left the floor. I walked her up the long staircase to her chambers, and we did not speak in the corridor. And at her door, she turned and said very quietly,
Are you coming in as a guard or as a man?
I don't know how to be only one of those things with you.
Decide before you cross the threshold.
I crossed. Chapter 11. The threshold crossed. She closed the door behind me herself. She slid the bolt I'd heard for the first time 3 weeks before, and it sounded different from this side. It sounded like a choice that had been made twice, once by her against me, and now by her, with me already inside it. Her room was warmer than the corridor. A small fire was set. The candles were low. Her bed was unmade from the afternoon nap she had taken before the ball, and the dagger was still under the pillow. She had not removed it. I noted that, and I was glad of it. I did not want her unguarded with me. Not yet. Possibly not ever. She came to me first. I had thought I would have to be the one to move. Across a long life, I had been wrong about a great many things, but most consistently about who would move first toward me when she finally chose to. She put her hands flat against the front of my coat, over the letter, and she stood there a moment with her palms against the place where the paper was. I felt my own pulse, faintly, the way I felt it only when she was near.
Tell me to leave.
No.
Tell me you have not decided.
I decided in the gallery on the first night.
She undid the high collar of my coat. I was braced for it. The whole walk up the stairs had tightened around that moment. I felt the cool air on my throat for the first time in years, and then her fingers found the line at my collarbone, the thin, pale ridge where Gideon's hand had pressed when he had held me down to die, and she traced it. I flinched. Her finger stayed. She traced it again. Then she leaned in and she kissed it, and I closed my eyes because my eyes had begun to do the thing they did when I had no control left, and I did not want her to see them like that on this night.
Open them.
She said. I opened them. She was looking at me with the silver, almost white eyes that had been the first thing about her I'd refused to look at directly, and they were not afraid. We undressed each other slowly. She let me take my time with the lacing of her bodice because she knew that I had not done this in long enough that I would otherwise have rushed and embarrassed both of us, and I let her unbutton my shirt because her fingers wanted to and because the scar wanted to be looked at, and I had not let it be looked at by anyone alive in 3 centuries. She kissed the scar properly when she had the shirt away. She did not say anything about it. She did not need to. She kissed it the way one kisses an old wound that has finally been brought into a room with enough light. We went to the bed. I lowered her into it as if she were the most fragile and the least fragile thing I'd ever held, which is what she was. She pulled me down after her by the open collar of my shirt. Her hair came loose around her shoulders. The hairpin shaped like a small blade fell on the floor. I let it. I kept my mouth closed against her skin. She felt it, the deliberation in it, the way I parted my lips only after I'd set my teeth, the careful geometry of a man who has been a predator longer than he has been anything else. Her hand came up to the back of my neck and held me there, neither pulling me in nor letting me lift, and she said, against my temple,
I know what you are.
I know you now.
Then stop making the shape of an apology.
I did. I kissed her properly. I felt her hand find the place on my chest where her own palm had rested earlier and stay there, and I felt her notice that I was not breathing. And I felt her not be afraid of that, and that was the moment something inside me let go that I had been holding without remembering I was holding. At some point, her mouth moved to the curve of her own throat. Not by her hand, but by tilting her chin, exposing the line of it to me, and offering. I shook my head.
No.
I am offering.
I know.
Take it.
No.
She let the command die. She watched my face. After a moment, she understood what I'd refused her, understood that the refusal was the gift, and she pulled me back down to her by the back of my neck. We did not speak after that for some time. When we did, it was dark and the fire had gone down to almost nothing, and her hair was across my chest, and the scar was warm where she had laid her cheek against it.
I have wanted you.
She said,
Since before I knew your face had a name.
I have wanted you.
I said.
Since the night you walked into my gallery.
She was quiet a moment.
That is a long 6 weeks.
It is a short 3 centuries.
She laughed, very softly against my collarbone, and then she slept. Her hand was nowhere near the dagger. I lay awake and watched her, and for the first time in many years, the guardian in me fell quiet. What remained was a man who had been allowed to want a thing and who had not yet finished being afraid of losing it. The letter was on the bedside table, where I had set it down when I had taken off the coat. The lower fold was still unfinished. Chapter 12. The Permission. The dawn came in gray and slow. She was still sleeping. Her hair had moved across her face, and she had not brushed it away in the night, and one of her hands had curled into a loose fist against the sheet near my arm. I sat up carefully. I dressed in pieces. I left the coat across the back of the chair because the letter was no longer in it. I took the letter to her writing desk. I unfolded it. The seal was already broken. The lower passage was already open. I had only to keep reading from the place where Jacob's interruption had stopped me. Live. Live, you stubborn old monster. Love. Let my blood become something more than a duty. I read it slowly. If you are reading this, you have already grieved too long. You have wrung the world for forgiveness you cannot get from a dead man because the dead do not deal in forgiveness, only in absence. The forgiveness is mine to give, and it is given, brother. It was given the moment I stepped where I did. I would have done it again. I would have done it the next day and the day after that. So would you for me. Stop trying to repay it. There is nothing owed. Watch over them, yes. Watch over them as a man watches over the children of someone he once loved, fondly, from a distance, ready when needed and not before. Do not watch them die. Do not stand in their corridors. Do not make a religion of my grave. Do you remember what I told you the night before Adele Marsh? You said you were not made for tenderness. I told you you were a liar. I tell you again in case you need it written down. Forgive yourself. That is my final order. Gideon. I read it twice. I read it a third time because I needed to make sure the words did not change. And they did not. And the third reading was the one that struck me. For 300 years I had carried this against my chest, an order to set it down. Fear had kept it sealed. I had expected condemnation, and all this time the page had held the only permission I'd ever needed. I closed the letter. I pressed my palms flat to the desk on either side of it and felt the grain of the wood under them. A fine, raised line where someone had once written too hard on a sheet that had been resting there, the indentation outliving the words. I held my hands there until they remembered they were mine. I had nearly done it again. To her. I had nearly walked 7 generations of corridors with her in them, watching from the door. I had pulled myself back from that just barely, and only because she had reached out and dragged me in. I needed to wake her. I needed to tell her. I needed to show her the page. I stood. I turned toward the bed. The door opened. Jacob did not knock. He had not knocked in 300 years. He stopped in the doorway with his sleeve dark and wet, and he held a hand against his side that he did not want me to look at directly, and he said one word.
Sire.
His other hand was on the door frame, and the door frame had a smear of red on it.
The castle is moving.
Chapter 13. The castle moves. I went to her first. She was already sitting up, already reaching for the dagger under the pillow, already understanding from my face and Jacob's sleeve what had happened. I told her to dress, and she dressed faster than I had ever seen a person dress. I told her to follow Jacob through the servants' passage to the east tower. No question. No wasted breath. She kissed me once, hard at the door. And then she was gone with Jacob ahead of her. And I went the other way, down the main corridor, toward the sound of running boots. I made it 3 corridors before I learned that Jacob had not made it to the east tower with her. I learned this because I came back to find him on the stairs, with a deeper wound than he had let me see, and an apology in his eyes that I refused to accept. They had taken her from the corridor between the servants' passage and the tower stair. 2 men. A third on the wicket gate. She had got one of them in the thigh with the dagger before they had pinned her wrists, and they had taken her out through a passage that, according to every map I had inherited, did not exist. I knew which passage. I had built it myself, 240 years before, as an escape route for a queen who had not lived long enough to use it. Morncliffe's house had owned the wing through which it ran for the last 60 years. I went to her chambers. The sheets were pulled half off the bed. The chair I had laid my coat over was overturned. The dagger she had drawn was missing. She had taken it with her. There was blood on the floor near the door, a fan-shaped spray that was not hers. She had hurt the second one, too. Of course she had. On my pillow, where I had not slept, lay a slim silver dagger and a folded note. The note named the abandoned chapel north of the city and a time 3 hours after dawn. I read it once. I set it down. I crossed to the chair and lifted my coat. My hand went, by 3 centuries of reflex, to the inner pocket, the small flat space along the breast where the letter had lived since before her great-grandmother had been born. The pocket was empty. My fingers closed on cloth and on nothing else, and the muscle of my hand did not at first believe it. I turned to the writing desk. The letter was where I had left it, unfolded in the warm morning light, the inner passage open. I crossed to it. I picked it up. I held it for one long moment against my chest in the place it had always been, and the old shape of carrying it fit my body the way a worn coat fits a man who has not taken it off in 100 years. Then I set it back down on the desk. I smoothed it flat. I weighted one corner with the brass inkstand so the morning draft from the window would not move it. I stood for a moment over the desk and looked at the page, and the page looked back at me. And forgive yourself. That is my final order, was the last thing I read before I turned away. I put on the coat. The inner pocket sat flat against my ribs, and the absence of the paper there was the strangest weight I had carried in a very long time. I went down to the armory. I took his sword off the wall. I went out through the courtyard. The watch had begun to break, and the household guards who had not been bought were forming up in the lower yard at Jacob's clipped, bleeding orders. I told them to hold the castle. I told them if I did not return by sunset, the crown passed to Jacob until a council could be called. Jacob's face did not change.
Sire, hold the gate. Sire.
I went alone. The letter stayed on the desk behind me. The castle moved around it without me. Chapter 14. The Chapel. The abandoned chapel north of the city had not been used since before her great-grandmother was born. The stained glass had broken in 3 of the windows. The altars had been overturned by looters and then by weather. And on the morning of my arrival, the floor was being put to a use it had not been built for. They had her in the center of the nave, bound at the wrists, kneeling on stone. 8 conspirators. Morncliffe at the front. The lady-in-waiting, Sabina, against the far wall, not bound, but not free either. Her handkerchief clutched at her sleeve, and her face wet with something that was not yet quite weeping. Julienne's hair was loose. There was a thin red line on her throat where the dagger had already been used to ask a question. Fear never quite found her face. She looked at me through the broken light when I came through the chapel doors, and her hands behind her back were already working at the rope. Severin smiled. He tilted his head the precise degree he always tilted it when he had walked into a room he believed he had already won, and he tapped the jeweled hilt of his dagger once against the stone of the overturned altar.
Your Majesty, evidently the witnesses were unnecessary.
The smile widened.
I confess I had hoped you might at least keep up the appearance of a king for one more morning. But here we are, the bride, the bridegroom, punctual.
I did not answer him.
I will offer her life,
he said pleasantly.
In exchange for an abdication signed in her blood. The signature, of course, is valid either way. The blood is, regrettably, required by the household president. You will appreciate the elegance. Your court will read it as her hand and yours together. A clean alliance, a clean grief, a clean transition.
He pressed the dagger to her throat for emphasis. The thin line opened a little wider. A drop ran down to her collarbone. I felt my eyes change.
Release her. Walk out alive.
He laughed, a small, polished laugh, and tilted his head the other way.
Oh, my king, you do not negotiate. You did not negotiate 3 centuries ago at Adelmarsh, and you do not negotiate now, which is, I think you'll concede, the consistency the council has long admired. But I am not negotiating either. I am offering. Be gracious enough to know the difference.
Then he moved. The dagger left her throat, a tell I had been waiting for. He pivoted clean and brought the silver blade up toward my chest in a move he had been practicing in dark rooms for longer than was kind. Julienne dropped flat to the stone. Her hands had finished the rope. I crossed the nave in a single movement. His wrist met my hand. The silver blade met the corner of the altar. Bone gave with a sound like a green stick. The dagger spun away across the flagstones and stopped against the foot of a broken pew. There would be no second weapon. The second conspirator came at me with a short sword, and I took the sword from his hand and I put it through the third one, who had been bringing a crossbow into line. The crossbow fell. The bolt drove itself into the wood of the door. The fourth tried to use a length of silver chain. Clever. I will grant them. And I took it from him and used it as a noose for half a breath, until he stopped having opinions about the morning. The 5th and the 6th ran for the side door. They did not reach the side door. The 7th went for the dagger on the floor and got there before me, which I allowed. I wanted to see what he would do with it. What he did with it was die holding it, which was the answer I'd expected. Sabina was the eighth, one hand braced against the wall. She stayed there. That was enough. I came back through them toward Severin. He had backed against the altar. His right wrist hung wrong. His dagger was on the floor. He was not smiling. I felt the candle smoke and the cold, stained glass dust in my mouth, and there was nothing in my face that anyone in that chapel would have recognized as the king they had insulted at a feast. Julienne had not turned away. She watched me come. She watched what I did when I reached him. I took my time. I broke the other wrist first because he had used both hands in his life to do small, ornamented cruelties, and I wanted him to know which hands. I bent him back against the altar slowly, the spine arching against the stone the way a question mark sets against a page, and I held him there while he tried to say something and could not arrange his face to say it. I kept my teeth from him. What I was doing had no need of hunger. I held him until the elegance went out of him, and then I held him a little longer because elegance was the thing he had spent his long life believing was the same as power, and I wanted him to feel the precise moment those two things were taken apart inside his own chest. When I let him fall against the altar, he made the same small punctuation sound his dagger had made against the table at the council, and he did not make any sound after that. I knelt. I knelt before her on the chapel floor with my hands still wet, and I waited. She came to me slowly. She did not kneel. She stood, and I knelt, and her hand came to rest very lightly on the top of my head, the way one rests a hand on the head of a man who has come a long way to find a thing he was not sure he was allowed to want.
Did you come because of the oath?
The oath ended the moment I read the letter. I came anyway.
She nodded.
Stop guarding me. I am tired of being a duty.
I already am.
Then stand up.
I stood. I was taller than her, and I had not noticed until that morning how much taller. She wiped a smear of blood from my cheek with the inside of her wrist where the ribbon was tied, and the ribbon went red, and she did not seem to mind. She looked past my shoulder.
Sabina.
Sabina flinched.
Come here.
Sabina came. Her steps were small and uncertain. Her eyes skirted the bodies on the floor. She stopped in front of Julienne and held out her hands as if for a blow. Julienne looked at her for a long moment, and then she said, evenly, to me, without taking her eyes off Sabina.
I have known for 4 days.
I did not speak.
You lied to me in the corridor outside the breakfast hall. You lied to me again in the dance. I let you keep the lie. I wanted to see when you would put it down.
She looked at me then.
You put it down on my writing desk this morning. I saw the letter when I dressed. I knew you had left it.
Princess.
That is the last secret.
She said.
You are allowed to keep from me.
She turned back to Sabina without waiting for me to answer.
Her sister.
They have her sister. I have known that since the 3rd night after I arrived. That is the leash.
Sabina's face crumpled.
My king will send agents. Your sister will be brought home alive. You will not be punished. You will, however, never serve in my retinue again. Do you understand?
Sabina nodded. She was weeping properly now.
I am sorry.
Sabina whispered.
Princess, I am so sorry. I know.
Julienne turned back to me. Her hand found mine. Her fingers were cold. Mine were warm with blood that did not belong to either of us. She had been watching me as long as I had been watching her family. She had simply been better at it. Chapter 15. The New Vow. We came back to the castle at midday. Morncliffe's house bent the knee to Jacob's blade before the sun was high, and the council, hastily reassembled, found in 3 hours, the spine it had failed to find in 30 years. Leontes Arkwright, who had been seen at Morncliffe's house twice in the preceding week, was expelled from court before sundown. The alliance held. Sabina's sister had not yet been recovered. 2 of my agents had ridden out at noon. The fastest of them would not reach the border for 9 days. Julienne kept a small written list of those 9 days folded inside the cuff of her sleeve, and I saw her touch the cuff, sometimes, in passing, the way a woman touches a debt she has decided to pay. Jacob took a chair at the council table that evening for the first time in 300 years. He did not announce it. He sat, with his bandaged side held a little stiff, and no one at the table mentioned it, and I made no comment. I did, later, in the corridor, bring him a glass of something he should not have been drinking with that wound, and he took it without looking at me, which was the closest thing to thanks he had ever given. I took her to the portrait gallery at dawn the next morning. The light was different at that hour. It came in long and pale through the tall east window, and it reached the gilded frames and turned the dust to gold, and I saw the empty frame in the eastern wall the way I had not been able to see it in 3 centuries. As a frame, with a wall behind it, and nothing else. She walked beside me, not behind, not ahead. She had the letter in her hands. I had given it to her that morning. I had taken it from her writing desk, where it had stayed since I had walked out of her chambers to the chapel, and I had folded it once carefully and placed it in her palm. She had read it overnight in the chair beside the fire, and at one point I had seen her wipe her face with the back of her hand and not let me see her do it. And then she had read it again with her composure put back on. We stopped in front of the empty frame. She looked at it for a long time.
It was meant to be mine.
It was meant to be the next one's. It happened to be yours.
And now...
Now, it is a frame on a wall.
She looked at me sideways. Her silver, almost white eyes caught the dawn.
You never answered me.
The first night in this gallery.
I waited.
Did the shadow ever weep?
I considered the empty frame. I considered the 7 portraits behind us in order. I considered the woman beside me who had walked into a chapel without turning her face away.
No, not in 300 years.
And now?
Now I am standing in the gallery in the morning, with you, and I am not certain I will be able to manage it for very much longer.
Her gaze held mine. No softness came into it. She held the letter against her chest in both hands the way I had held it for 300 years, and then she lowered it, very deliberately, and she handed it back to me, and she said,
Make me a vow.
I'd been waiting for her to ask. I knelt. This was the posture of a man offering something to one person and not to a kingdom.
I vow to love you as a choice and not a debt. I vow to let you be dangerous beside me. I vow not to stand in corridors. I vow, on the day this becomes a cage, to open the door and let you walk out of it.
She considered me.
That last part
She said.
Is the one I will hold you to.
I know.
She held out her hand. I took it. She pulled me to my feet, and I went because she had a remarkable economy of strength, and because I had decided some time ago to go wherever her hand pulled me. She slept that night in her own bed, with her back to the door, and the dagger was not under the pillow. She had given it to Jacob earlier in the evening to be cleaned. She had not asked for it back yet. She might tomorrow. She might not. She might keep one under the pillow for the rest of her life. That would be a thing she chose. And I would not look at it the way I'd looked at the one before. I did not watch her sleep from the balcony. I watched her sleep from the chair beside the bed for a little while, because I was still learning the difference between vigil and presence. And then I lay down beside her, which I had also not done before, and I closed my eyes. The letter was in a drawer in her writing desk now. not against my chest, not in a sealed compartment, in a drawer she could open. In the gallery, the empty frame was still empty. I had decided, walking back to her chambers that evening, not to fill it. Some empty spaces are not graves. She turned in her sleep and put a hand against my chest, in the place where the letter had lived for 3 centuries. And she did not find paper there, only the slow, almost still beat of an old heart that had remembered, very recently, how to do its work. Outside the window, the first real snow of the winter began to come down very gently over the courtyard, the way it had come down once on a pass at Adel Marsh, on 2 men who had not yet finished what they would do for each other. I watched it through the gauze of the curtain for a long time. Her hand stayed on my chest. I did not move it.
I hope you enjoyed this story. If it kept you company, liking and subscribing would mean so much. Your support helps me keep creating as a solo storyteller. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.